world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. We're thrilled to be joined by Devie Mohan today. Devie is a prominent fintech writer, speaker, and commentator. Devie is the co-founder and CEO of Burnmark, a fintech research company established in partnership with Berlin-based FinLeap. She's also a market strategist and UK coordinator with FinLeap. Throughout the course of her career, Devie has helped numerous banks, startups, innovation groups, and investors understand the trends in fintech, helping them set their corporate, marketing, and investment strategies. She's an adamant proponent of a fintech ecosystem in which banks and startups collaborate to drive innovation. Devie is featured on several fintech influencer lists, including the CityAM FinTech Powerlist and the SWIFT-Innotribe Power Women in Fintech list, just to name two. Devie, welcome to Rebank.
Pleasure to be here, Will. Thanks for having me.
So tell us a bit about your work at Burnmark.
So Burnmark is very new. We launched in October, so just a few weeks ago, and it's the first fintech research company, if I can put it that way. Burnmark really came about as an idea a few months ago, and FinLeap and I both felt that the fintech industry is now kind of in the middle of a new phase where it needs kind of direction, it needs kind of the use cases and the figures from the past to guide it forward. And that idea was discussed and developed into Burnmark over the last few months. And the first report, as you might have seen, is on challenger banking. So very, very exciting space to write about. And we do have some very interesting use cases already on that space. And we've looked at how challenger banks have impacted huge scale of the population, for example, in India and China. And we have looked at the kind of innovation that we are seeing here in the UK. So we have taken a global view to Burnmark and the kind of research that we do. We are working on the next report, and it's very exciting to be with Burnmark at the moment.
Well, I saw the Challenger Bank report. It's great. I look forward to getting into that. So for context, is the focus of Burnmark around producing reports and publishing them? Is it providing kind of specific advisory or consultancy to incumbents, to investors, to startups?
So the primary aim is to really productize all the information we have in fintech. So we want to create a product that people can just plug in and use. So that comes from a research report angle, where every month we cover a theme in detail. But secondly, and more importantly to me, we provide all the underlying data as a platform through Burnmark. And this is something I've found that's very useful for banks, for investors, for startups, for anyone looking to enter the fintech space, really. And all the data, for example, what kind of products are challenger banks launching around the world. So we have a list of all the challenger banks in the world, all the products they're offering, all the services they're offering, the key unique value proposition they have, and the rates, the interest rates they are offering the products at. So that kind of data would be absolutely valuable to anyone. So instead of giving it as a consulting, the same data, I would rather give it as a product which anyone can subscribe to and use on a regular basis. Okay, that makes sense. And we'll get a bit more into kind of the various areas that you're looking at. But you mentioned challenger banking was the first segment that you put out a report on. You mentioned there's a report in the works now. What are kind of the, first 3 or 4 segments of fintech that you guys plan to look at? So again, we've gone by what the market is asking for. So challenger banking was clearly the hot topic for everyone. Banks trying to partner with fintech startups to create a kind of challenger banking environment too. So that's definitely the hot topic for us to begin with. The next report will be on InsurTech. Again, a very, very hot topic for everyone at the moment. And to me, InsurTech will probably be a much larger industry in terms of cost savings and in terms of innovation potential compared to fintech. So I'm actually looking through all the costs that the traditional the legacy insurance firms are going through at the moment. And we look at underwriting, claims management, documentation, and you find that with InsurTech, you can actually save billions of dollars every year. So we're looking at huge amounts of money with InsurTech. And then we will look at open banking, which is another report we're working on. And we will have regulatory technologies and cognitive technologies, wealth management. So these are some of the reports in the works.
Wow, that sounds very interesting. Look forward to seeing those as they come out. In the first report on challenger banking, which I've read a few times, it's great work. Tell the audience which markets you guys looked at. Did you approach that from a UK-centric standpoint, or was it a global report?
So there are two angles, I would say, to that question. So we looked at the UK because the largest number of challenger banks coming up are in the UK. So we have looked at around 35 new banks that are launching or have launched in the UK in the last 3 years. So UK is definitely a huge market from that perspective. So we've looked at the reasons why UK has emerged as the challenger banking capital in the world. We've looked at the kind of friendly environment with the regulatory authorities compared to the rest of the world. We've looked at the interest rates, the shifting demographics, and the desire for the younger population to have something like an Uber for banking. But more importantly, on the other side, we have looked at true innovation. And I'll probably talk more about that later, but true innovation is where we can actually move from the tenets of innovation and talk about how do we monetize some of the technology that's coming up? How do we get cost savings, or how do we improve the revenues for either existing companies or in the market in general with these new challenger banks coming up? So it means more partnerships that actually can be monetized, and it means targeting huge segments of population in one go. And for that, I've looked at India, China, and Singapore, and some other Southeast Asian countries to really understand how are they taking banking to scale? How are they making revenues from a mobile payment company, for example, and offer all kinds of products on that platform to monetize it. So innovation is very interesting from that angle, Africa, Asia, and China as a scalable market. And the sheer number of challenger banks coming up, the UK and US. UK has been really good, and Germany and US to a certain extent.
When you guys talk about challenger banking, is it synonymous with digital banking, or does it stretch more broadly?
Challenger banking, by definition, is very, very niche. So it has to be fundamentally digital. So it has to be either an app, or in some cases, we have stretched it to say it can be a website, but definitely no branches. But during the course of the study, what we saw was that we need to look at the periphery as well. So we need to understand more about the traditional banks offering digital products, for example. We need to look at mobile payment companies, like I said, who offer banking products on the payments platform. So if you look at the digital products being offered in the market, that's what's driving the innovation. So we went one step beyond to look at the periphery of all digital banking products offered through multiple channels, but the scope would very clearly be challenger banks, which means they're digital players and not traditional banks offering digital products.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that there are 35 or something challenger banks that meet this definition in the UK that have either launched or are preparing to launch. Outside of the UK, so in the US or in Asia, continental Europe, which other markets did you guys pay particular attention to?
So we've looked at China quite a bit. So China has an interesting dynamic because they have the scale, but they don't have the innovation which can be stretched to other parts of the world. An example is WeBank, a really, really great banking product. And we work with some translators to look at the product, etc. And in India, some examples would be DigiBank, which has actually been bought by a traditional bank now. So I don't know where to classify them, but DigiBank, when they started out, they had a very digital ambition in terms of making the experience of banking very, very easy. And in Malaysia, we have MyBank. In Brazil, you have Nubank. So again, there's no one country where you would say there's a whole lot of innovation happening in this space, apart from the UK. But I've seen really good examples from all these different places.
In the UK, I guess the focus of kind of the challenger banking movement seems to be on replacing what people think of as antiquated incumbent offerings with new, more modern propositions. That's, I suppose, relatively iterative in terms of steps forward. It's not disruptive the way that other technologies may have been in recent years, but potentially in non-developed markets, less developed markets, at least outside the US and the UK, there is potential for huge fundamental change in terms of bringing large swaths of the population that may previously have been unbanked or underbanked into the formal banking community. Has that been a part of the focus in terms of some of the Asian or South American markets that you mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. We haven't looked at it as much as we would like to because financial inclusion is a completely different topic and probably something we'll do a report on at some stage by itself. You're right. I mean, in the UK, there were 100,000 new accounts created last year. So if you look at that, this includes people coming back into banking who have been disillusioned and they're coming back into banking, or these are the young millennial population that we are all targeting from a fintech angle who are coming into the banking population, and either with challenger banks or traditional banks. So 100,000 is not a huge number per se. That number in China was 200 million. In India was 187 million. And in Africa was around 37 million. So that is the scale difference we're talking about in terms of getting new people into banking. But there is a fundamental problem here, and that's something that I keep talking about, in that bringing people into the banking world by itself is not sufficient. Do they actively become that product user? I mean, and I'm sure that every bank out there is trying to figure that out, but so the 187 million figure from India, for example, we found that 43% of those new bank account holders were not using bank accounts 1 year down the line. So it's very worrying for the banks that they put so much effort in creating something, creating a platform, and bringing people into the platform. And customer acquisition is very, very expensive, regardless of where you are in the world. But once they come on the platform, they're not using it, or they drop off. And that's a bigger worry to me than actually bringing people into the banking platform.
You talked about some, I think you referred to it as the periphery of banking. Think of it as non-bank financial services providers who are often doing some really interesting things at the moment. Viewing this from a traditional US-UK perspective, we think of banks being a fundamental part of people's interactions and financial lives. You could see how in kind of less developed economies from a banking standpoint, how the bank per se may not need to be the center of everyone's financial lives, and you could use a local payment app which maybe provides an overdraft facility instead of an FDIC or an FSCS insured deposit taking institution to do your banking. And presumably, well, it sounds like you looked at some of those types of offerings in the context of challenger banking. Do you see those as being particularly transformative?
In some countries, yes. So we know about M-Pesa, which has done extremely well, and it's a good case study for any kind of mobile payment service. But M-Pesa has been implemented, or they have tried to implement it in other parts of the world, and it's not really taken off. Then it actually begs the question, what is it about M-Pesa that became successful at that particular time in that particular region? So it's very, very, very regional and very ecosystem based. It may not work again in another part of the world. So in the UK, I honestly don't see anything like that working at all. I would say the challenger banks and the traditional banks have a huge advantage in the UK because most of the people are banked here in the UK already. They're familiar with the system. And the same goes with the US and Germany or any other part of Western Europe. But if you're looking at Africa with no legacy and no experience with banking, the mobile system works really well. And the fact that M-Pesa works on basic Nokia phones and you don't need smartphones for it, it meant that every person who had a phone, which is pretty much everyone in Africa, could use the services that we call banking, but for them it's just a mobile-based service. And India, it's a mix of both. In India, they have both traditional banking as well as huge amount of mobile penetration. So there are people who are comfortable with mobile phones for their banking transactions and some people who are absolutely not. So it's a mix of both. I think the key is the stage at which the country is in terms of the demographics, in terms of the adoption, in terms of the social ecosystem, the network for mobile phones versus banking. So it's very hard to say. And the fact that M-Pesa hasn't worked in other parts of the world kind of tells you that it's not about innovation. It's about how you and when you take it to market.
In the grand scheme of things, the US and the UK aren't dissimilar in terms of markets. Yet we've seen, again, as you mentioned, 35 new banks coming to market in the UK. In the US, apart from Simple and Moven, which were kind of very, very early days of digital banking, we haven't seen any particularly new propositions. And Moven and Simple weren't actually licensed banks. In the U.S., traditionally, there have been hundreds of new bank charters granted each year. But in the past 5+ years, there haven't really been any. What's going on in the U.S. right now? Why isn't challenger banking important?
It's funny because Simple and Moven were probably the earliest examples of challenger banks. And I don't know about you, but when I was in the fintech space very early on, we used to look at Simple and Moven as the best case studies to really follow in terms of customer experience. So we all learned from it in a way. But now you're right, and there's been nothing after that. I think there are two reasons for it. One is that the U.S. banking is very regional. When I used to live in the U.S., I had an account with a bank, and any bank I would go to, they would have a presence in 3 states. That's it. So if I was living in Washington, D.C., they would have branches in Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. If I went to a fairly bigger bank, it would have a branch in New York, maybe if I'm lucky, but nothing that had a countrywide branch network really. And Citibank would have probably a huge network, but again, not in every state in the US. So it is a very regional form of banking, and that's why community banks come up with the most innovation in the US, because they understand their community really well. They target products at that community, and they don't have much of legacy. And even if they have legacy, it's fairly easy to move on. And they have done fairly well. Anyone who's looked at capturing the entire US market, they have struggled, in my opinion. So one is that, very clearly the nature of the customers, they are not looking at countrywide banking, but that could change with the coming of apps and challenger banks in a way. The other problem is the regulatory environment again, because the UK has been very friendly towards working with smaller companies in terms of launching them really quickly. And Germany is learning from the UK, and Solaris Bank, which is one of FinLeap's companies, and it got a license in about 6 months. So from BaFin in Germany. And that has been a great example of really, really quick licensing process in Germany. So I think some of the countries are really good at working with individual companies and helping them launch. And the UK has been absolutely fantastic in working with a huge number of them and adapting the framework to help those kind of firms. And actually talking to all the startups to figure out if they need a license or not. Are there other paths that they could go to? And the UK has been absolutely fantastic in that. The US, that dialogue is much, much less. They are talking about individual cases, but there has not been a clear movement in terms of changing the framework. I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on US regulations, but from my point of view, I haven't seen a lot of support from the regulations to these new banks. So on one side, the demand is not that great, and on the other side, the regulatory support is not that great. So the ecosystem hasn't really emerged. But having said that, they could be the ones coming up with a really, really successful challenger bank in the future, because you have all the technology know-how in the Silicon Valley, and you have a huge amount of banking knowledge in New York, which can be combined very easily.
So if challenger banking in the US, early stage, Moven and Simple, and then more recently in the UK has largely been focused around user experience and improvement in banking, making banking easier to do. And in developing countries, it's often been more related to financial inclusion and creating ways for previously unbanked people to bring their financial management into the banking system. Things like InsurTech and indeed other parts of fintech have been more focused around cost management, cost cutting, efficiency enhancement. So specifically in the context of the work you guys are doing on InsurTech at the moment, talk to us about the power of InsurTech, what impact it's likely to have on the insurance industry.
Yeah, without giving away too much of what's going to be in the report, we're looking at two angles, really. It's very similar to how fintech has developed in the UK versus Asia, for example. InsurTech in the UK and in the US are primarily focused on the front end, the customer experience. So you have insurance carriers like Lemonade, and you have the insurance brokers, and you have aggregators and comparison tools, and anything that helps you manage your existing insurance policies or have a much easier life getting and much easier process getting an insurance policy. So that's what the UK and US have focused on. Whereas in Asia and in Africa, a lot of the innovation is coming out of the back end of InsurTech, which is underwriting and claims and processing of documentation. And we're actually going to have a case study on a very interesting company in Africa who uses the power of the community to do underwriting. So you don't do it manually, but you use the power of peer-to-peer underwriting to save billions of dollars in that process. So when you have a much leaner, much more agile backend, it's much easier for new players to come on. So that's the change we're going to see in InsurTech, or in the insurance industry rather, because the moment the technology makes it feasible to reduce your costs down to nothing with the power of social media and AI and cognitive technologies, then what will happen is you can launch insurance products on the fly, which is not happening today. So that industry is going to see a lot of movement in the next 5 years is what we are seeing.
And you mentioned RegTech before as an area where you guys are likely to do some work in the future. And I think that things like KYC and AML specifically are interesting areas ripe for innovation. I will very much look forward to in any work you guys do in that space, because I don't think that the vast majority of bankers or fin-techies necessarily understand the implications of KYC AML. It seems scary from an outsider's standpoint. I think once you build the knowledge and clarity around what it actually means, there are interesting things you can do in that space. I don't know if you've done any work historically in KYC AML, and if you'd have any thoughts about developments in the market and what the potential is there.
It's funny because I think almost every panel I've been on, if there's a banker involved, the KYC topic will come up. And I've seen that happening again and again. I mean, we would have no script talking about KYC, but somehow it'll end up. Because I think that's a very, very big challenge for the banks to manage KYC. And like you said, we all worry about it because we don't understand it enough. And I don't right now, but I'm hoping to understand it a bit more when we do the research. But the fact remains that it doesn't have to be that hard. For example, again, when I was in Africa talking to a lot of these startups, a lot of the banks were using iPad-based KYC with field agents walking around on farmland and just taking pictures of the documentation, pictures of the people, of the farmers, and putting it into the system. So they had a concept of field agents who were so effective in capturing KYC information and thus bringing people into the banking system. So it doesn't have to be that scary. It can be very simple. And I know a few challenger banks in the UK who do KYC for refugees, for example. And if you look at that, they have no background in the UK, but they might have a background in the country they're coming from. So they could be professionals with salaried income for several years before coming into the UK. So there are systems now being developed to understand their previous background before they have come into a new country, which was never the case. I mean, I was lucky to get a bank account as soon as I moved into this country because my employer took it for me, but otherwise it's really, really hard to get that early on. So that's being addressed, which is really, really great. But I want to make it clearer, like you said, and more fun, because it doesn't have to be difficult. There are innovative ways of doing this. So we want to look at case studies in other parts of the world to help banks in the UK to kind of say, you can't blame KYC for everything going wrong and the amount of time it would take for onboarding. There are technologies out there that can help you. So that's something I'm really excited to be doing.
You mentioned some of the travel that you did in preparing the Challenger Bank report. Were there any other particularly interesting trips or parts of the world that you saw getting that ready?
I didn't travel to do the report. I just ended up traveling anyway, and I would end up talking to fintech startups. From challenger banking, I think my time in Africa definitely helped. And again, in Germany, because FinLeap is a German company, and we have a lot of experience from the individual companies that FinLeap works with. Solaris Bank being a great example. So their experience going through the banking license was a really useful information for me. I also look at India because I'm from India and I understand the market fairly well. And Singapore, there are a lot of banks working on completely new, innovative processes in Singapore, so definitely interesting. I'm looking forward to go to China someday and understand more about what they're doing.
Tell us a bit about FinLeap for those who aren't familiar with it. You mentioned their involvement with Solaris Bank. What does FinLeap do?
So FinLeap is a venture builder based in Berlin, and they've been one of the earliest venture builders in the fintech space in Europe. And they came up with a need to really build companies based on gaps in the market. So they help and support new fintech ventures being launched where they see a customer gap or a market gap, and then they work through with the team building the company and then launching them in the market. So Solaris Bank is one of the latest ventures to be launched, and that kind of came from the experience of launching an insurtech firm, a savings firm, and multiple firms, and that experience was kind of brought in to launch Solaris Bank, which is a bank based on a platform. So this is the platform banking that we've been talking about for years, and they've actually done it. And they have started with a number of products and expanding it quite a bit at the moment. So it'd be interesting to watch their journey as well.
So Devie, I'll leave the final word to you. What would be the most transformative areas of fintech in your view? What are you most excited about at the moment?
I think fintech has reached the second phase of its development. So 3 years ago, we were talking about the need for innovation and why banks should change. But I think we have gone past that now. I think everyone knows why we should change, and everyone knows the importance of innovation. So I think that first phase is really over. I think this second phase would be a bit tricky and a bit challenging looking at it very generically, because we don't understand what use cases have worked and will work in the short term and in the long term. So there will be a little bit of confusion, and that's what we are hoping to address with Burnmark. But this is the most exciting phase, because this is where we're going to see sustainable value creation in the market. All that we have learned in the last 3 years in the first phase, we're bringing it to this level to create something which will be truly long-term and truly sustainable. And what's exciting is that now we are not talking about sectors and silos like payments, lending, KYC, biometrics, challenger banking. We are actually thinking in terms of use cases. We are thinking, is there a KYC biometrics-based solution that can work very well for a newly banked market? So we are bringing elements of challenger banking, RegTech, and security technology to create solutions that work for the market. So to me, that is the most exciting thing, that we are talking now horizontally rather than vertically.
That's a really interesting point, because I guess the whole fintech wave initially kind of started based on, well, I can do this specific product better than an incumbent bank can. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to steal some of their customers. And that was replicated time and again. But now, as you're saying, we're looking at even something like the Solaris Bank model, the bank as a platform model. It's what is the underlying issue, and how can we solve that in a way that really supports the industry in a broad way, not just in one specific geography, but potentially globally. Devie Mohan, thank you so much for joining us today. What's the best way for people to connect with you and find out more about your work at Burnmark?
Thank you so much, Will. It has been an absolutely great pleasure being here and talking to you. So the best way to reach me is via Twitter. I'm always on Twitter, so anyone can message me there. I'm at Devie_Mohan.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.